July 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Heat lay on the red clay like a lid, cicadas drilling the afternoon stillness, when a 212-ton truck marked with red crosses rattled through the gates and braked beside the supply shed. Behind barbed wire and guard towers, men of the Afrika Korps and U-boat crews, sunburnt faces dulled by routine, stared as wooden crates were pried open and stacked with methodical clatter. Labels showed evaporated milk, tins of meat, rolled oats, soap, cigarettes. Then, to a murmur that rose like wind in pines, neat rows of chocolate appeared, wrapped and whole. For soldiers schooled to expect turnip soup and grey bread, the sight struck like a trick of light. A sergeant from the 15th Panzer later wrote that his first thought was bait. Yet the guards logged the parcels, counted them out and moved on. No lecture, no exchange demanded, only the matter-of-fact fulfillment of rules older than the moment. The 1929 Geneva Convention's promise that captives would be fed and might receive relief through the International Red Cross. By evening, the first bars were broken along their scored lines. The smell drifted across the barracks, fat, cocoa, a memory of cafes and peacetime chatter, until even the skeptics tasted. Word traveled bunk to bunk and then block to block. The Americans had sent comfort through the wire. Some called it propaganda, others proof that the enemy did not fear showing mercy. As rations and parcels continued, Aliceville held roughly 6,000 prisoners by mid-1944. The question spread with the sweetness. Why would a nation spend good food on those sworn to fight it? The answer lay beyond the fence in policy, logistics, and a carefully tended image of power that the next chapter will follow, from factory to campgate. By early 1943, the United States had become an unlikely custodian of the defeated enemy. More than 370,000 German prisoners of war were dispersed across over 500 camps, from the cotton fields of Texas to the pine forests of Minnesota. Barbed wire stitched its way across the continent, but inside those fences, the order of captivity took on a character few prisoners expected. The 1929 Geneva Convention required humane treatment, adequate shelter, food, and medical care, but America's implementation often exceeded those obligations. At Aliceville, Camp Ruston, and scores of others, German soldiers found clean bunks, running water, and infirmaries staffed by U.S. Army doctors. Rations followed the same caloric standards as for American troops, sometimes even better, as food in the States remained abundant compared to the strained supply lines of Europe. It was a level of welfare that unsettled men raised on Nazi depictions of the barbaric Anglo-Americans. The International Committee of the Red Cross became the essential bridge between captivity and home. Their convoys brought comfort parcels packed with soap, cigarettes, tinned beef, condensed milk, and, most astonishing to many, the smooth, brown slabs of chocolate that smelled of peacetime. To Washington, such generosity was deliberate policy. Humane treatment was not only moral but strategic. Every chocolate bar or clean sheet was a quiet message to the Reich, reinforcing America's image as lawful and civilized, and ensuring that Allied prisoners in Germany might benefit from reciprocal care. Yet behind the wire, these gestures stirred confusion and wounded pride. Some prisoners interpreted kindness as manipulation, others as proof that the Nazi vision of the enemy was hollow. That uneasy mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and reluctant respect formed the foundation for the psychological and cultural transformations that would soon unfold within America's prison camps. By 1944, the Red Cross parcel had become both a symbol and an instrument of civilization amid war. Each one weighed roughly 11 pounds and represented a triumph of coordination across oceans and ideologies. Produced chiefly in neutral Switzerland and Canada, these boxes adhered to a standardized blueprint agreed upon by the International Committee of the Red Cross, a balance between nutrition, morale, and practicality. Inside lay the essentials: condensed milk, biscuits, jam, margarine, canned corned beef, powdered coffee, sugar, soap, and cigarettes, arranged with geometric precision. Tucked among them were 4 chocolate bars, each precisely 100 grams, sealed in foil and wax paper. The brands varied, Hershey, Nestlé, or Swiss Caille, but all were chosen less for indulgence than endurance. Their high cocoa concentration and paraffin-based stabilizers resisted melting in tropical heat or the uncooled holds of Liberty ships, ensuring the bars arrived unspoiled months after departure. Each parcel was stamped with the Crimson Cross and recorded by serial number before leaving Swiss or Canadian warehouses. From there, crates traveled by rail to Lisbon, the neutral hub of wartime exchange where Allied shipping convoys ferried them across the Atlantic to U.S. ports like New York or New Orleans. Once inland, the Army's Quartermaster Corps and Red Cross delegates jointly supervised delivery to the 500-odd camps spread across America's interior. Regulations required that no item could be used for barter or escape. Tins were opened under inspection, knives removed, strings shortened. But even so, the parcels felt like miracles. To German soldiers accustomed to scarcity, these shipments revealed a supply network that functioned with almost industrial perfection. What few realized was that behind every box lay the labor of thousands, neutral diplomats, factory workers, and railway crews sustaining an invisible artery of humanity. Through those 11 pounds of cocoa, milk, and care, the Allies practiced a diplomacy of decency, turning nourishment into quiet persuasion. By February 1944, the first major consignments of Red Cross parcels rolled into the Deep South, where the war seemed both impossibly distant and endlessly present. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, and Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, trucks groaned through humid air thick with pine resin and red dust, their cargo guarded less like contraband and more like treasure. For the German prisoners, many veterans of the Afrika Korps or the Atlantic convoys, the monotony of captivity had dulled every sense. The heat was relentless, the landscape foreign, and the slow rhythm of drills and roll calls stretched the days into sameness. Then suddenly, the gates opened to a sight that felt like a breach in routine. Wooden crates stamped with crimson crosses, unloaded under a white southern sun. When the lids were pried off, the smell of cocoa and coffee mingled with dust and diesel, cutting through the still air like memory itself. Distribution was carried out under German non-commissioned officers, their efficiency intact even in captivity. American guards stood aside, careful and impartial, counting parcels and marking names with bureaucratic precision that startled the prisoners. Inside the barracks, men unwrapped their chocolate bars as though unveiling relics. Some rationed the squares over weeks. Others sliced them into slivers and traded pieces for cigarettes, razor blades, or favors. Within days, a barter economy flourished, a miniature market where sweetness became the most valued currency. The chocolate's taste seemed to bridge time. Men spoke of mothers' kitchens in Cologne, of Christmas stalls dusted with sugar, of peacetime laughter long buried under rubble. The sensory memory of cocoa did what interrogation could not. It reconnected them to the world beyond ideology. Yet for many, that kindness carried a sting. How could the same Americans who bombed Hamburg send gifts wrapped in mercy? That contradiction unsettled them, planting a seed of doubt that would grow quietly in the months ahead. Reports of their disciplined behavior soon reached newspapers back home, cited as proof that the U.S. ran model camps. In that small sweetness, America had found a silent tool of persuasion, one far more enduring than propaganda. By the summer of 1944, word of the Red Cross parcels, especially the chocolate, had begun to seep back across the Atlantic in thin blue envelopes and censored postcards. Even stripped of detail, the message was unmistakable. American captivity was not the nightmare Berlin had promised. Letters from camps like Aliceville and Tonkawa mentioned full meals, medical care, and sweet gifts from the enemy. At first, censors in Germany dismissed these lines as exaggerations. But when the volume of such reports grew, the propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels moved swiftly to contain the damage. Radio bulletins and army newspapers warned that Allied rations were poisoned with drugs meant to dull German willpower, and that chocolate from American hands contained moral contagion, a metaphor for defeat disguised as kindness. Soldiers at the front were told that captured comrades were victims of psychological warfare, not beneficiaries of decency. Yet inside the camps, those warnings rang hollow. The prisoners knew the difference between myth and taste. American chocolate, dense with real cocoa and sugar, bore no resemblance to the meager, starch-thick ersatz bars issued in Germany, where shortages had long stripped food of joy. Reports reaching Allied intelligence confirmed the shift, disbelief giving way to curiosity, then to something subtler, respect. Analysts at the Office of War Information noted that generosity, not propaganda, was eroding Nazi credibility among its own men. Even within the fences, ideological loyalists tried to resist. A handful of officers forbade their subordinates to touch enemy goods, declaring it unpatriotic. But hunger and memory proved stronger than slogans. By early 1945, most of those same men were quietly pocketing their share, their defiance dissolving with each bite. What began as suspicion ended as reluctant acknowledgement, a realization that their captors' humanity had outlasted their own regime's myth. And so, with every bar unwrapped, the boundary between enemy and human grew a little thinner. By the middle of 1944, the humble Red Cross package stood atop one of the most sophisticated humanitarian supply chains in wartime history. Its movement across oceans and borders required as much precision as any military convoy, yet its cargo was mercy instead of munitions. The American Red Cross, working hand in hand with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, managed a network that stretched from neutral warehouses in Switzerland and Canada to remote prison camps across the American plains. Each crate was numbered, weighed, and recorded by prisoner ID before being loaded aboard neutral ships via Lisbon, the nerve center of wartime exchange. From there, transatlantic convoys carried the parcels to Allied ports, where the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps took command, routing shipments through railway lines that pulsed like veins through the American heartland. By June 1944, more than 27 million such parcels had been distributed worldwide to prisoners of all nationalities. Within the United States, inspectors verified that each camp met the 3,000-calorie daily requirement mandated by the Geneva Convention, supplementing with fresh vegetables and meat when possible. The chocolate alone demanded its own logistical choreography. Wartime restrictions on cocoa butter forced American confectioners, Hershey, Nestlé, and Mars to experiment with stabilizers that preserved flavor under heat and humidity. German POWs, unfamiliar with this waxy texture, sometimes mistook it for inferiority, unaware it was the taste of science meeting compassion. In a world consumed by secrecy and suspicion, the Allies made their supply chain transparent by design. Every ledger entry, every seal, every recorded weight testified to a deliberate contrast. Democracy organized for decency, even toward the enemy. As the convoys continued their quiet crossings, they did more than deliver food. They carried proof that order, not hatred, could still govern a world at war. That principle would soon guide America's broader humanitarian strategy in the final years of conflict. Within the fences of America's prisoner-of-war camps, life gradually assumed the rhythm of an uneasy peace. Rows of barracks, once symbols of confinement, became the framework for a strange imitation of civilian society. By late 1944, German prisoners had organized councils, orchestras, theater troupes, and even printed their own camp newspapers on mimeograph machines supplied by the Red Cross. The hum of daily routine replaced the clatter of combat boots. Classes in mathematics, carpentry, and English filled the long hours, often taught by educated prisoners or sympathetic guards. Amid this improvised order, chocolate, the most coveted commodity, took on a role that far exceeded its taste. A single bar might purchase an extra serving of bread, a hand-drawn portrait, or a translation lesson. Within weeks, cocoa had become the currency of an underground economy that ran on trust rather than command. For many prisoners, the civility they encountered was disarming. They watched American guards laugh freely, share cigarettes, and treat captured officers with the same procedural respect given to their own. A bar of chocolate traded across the fence or gifted to a child at play became a quiet gesture of recognition, an acknowledgement that the war existed beyond hatred. Camp chaplains later remarked that these exchanges accomplished what lectures on democracy could not. They humanized the abstract. The camps, bounded by wire yet softened by routine, became laboratories of behavior, where men tested what dignity meant in defeat. Still beneath the politeness, homesickness grew like rust. Letters told of bombed cities, starving families, and the collapse of everything they had once fought for. Each sweet parcel that arrived from neutral ports became both comfort and burden, a reminder that they were safe while their homeland suffered. That contrast would linger in memory long after the gates finally opened, shaping how these men would speak of America when the war was over. By the closing months of 1944, a quiet transformation inside America's POW camps had begun to draw the attention of the War Department's psychologists. Observers from the Army's morale branch filed reports describing a curious pattern. German prisoners exposed to consistent fairness. Steady food supplies and small luxuries, especially chocolate, were calmer, more cooperative, and far less inclined to attempt escape. The shift defied conventional military logic. Discipline had not been enforced through fear, but through decency. A single chocolate bar, they noted, carried a symbolic power far beyond its caloric value. It was a sensory link to normalcy, to the lost rhythms of civilian life. When a man who had been taught that Americans were decadent and corrupt bit into real cocoa and sugar instead of the synthetic substitutes of wartime Germany, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. For many who had grown up within the rigid doctrines of Hitler Youth or the Wehrmacht's ideological training, that taste became their first experience of moral dissonance. In censored letters routed through Switzerland, phrases began to appear. The enemy understands respect. We are treated as men. Allied intelligence quickly recognized the propaganda potential. Leaflets dropped over German lines began to echo these sentiments, promising humane captivity and good rations. You will eat well in America, one read. And for once the claim was true, the results were measurable. Surrender rates rose, escape attempts dwindled, and even hardline officers reported difficulty maintaining ideological control over their men. Psychologists concluded that small acts of kindness were dismantling years of indoctrination more effectively than any interrogation. The chocolate bar, humble and sweet, had become a psychological instrument, a quiet dissolving agent against fanaticism. As 1945 approached, this unlikely weapon of compassion was already doing what force could not, turning enemies into thinkers and soldiers into men again. By April 1945, as the Reich crumbled under Allied bombardment, the calculus of surrender shifted overnight. Along the collapsing Western Front, whole battalions began laying down their arms, not out of ideology but of expectation. Tales of American camps, of clean beds, medical care, and Red Cross chocolate had traveled faster than orders from Berlin. Soldiers whispered that captivity in U.S. hands meant food, safety, even dignity. Leaflets dropped by Allied aircraft promised the same, and those who had heard from captured comrades through coded letters believed it. For many, surrender no longer meant annihilation. It meant survival. At ports such as Le Havre and Cherbourg, columns of prisoners marched past smoking ruins toward holding depots where the first taste of American rations, bread still warm, fruit, and the now familiar chocolate bars confirmed the rumors. Civilians watching from shattered doorways were stunned. While their own families survived on turnip soup and ersatz coffee, these defeated soldiers were fed and photographed, their captors methodical rather than vengeful. In the ruins of Germany, mothers would later tell each other that their sons ate well in America, a phrase heavy with both envy and disbelief. To Allied commanders, this was no accident, but policy. Humane treatment had become a weapon of stability, reducing resistance, accelerating capitulation, and ensuring order in liberated zones. Yet for the men themselves, the experience was bewildering. In post-war interrogations, many admitted that their first true doubt about Nazism came not from defeat on the battlefield, but from the realization that the supposed barbaric enemy had treated them with honor. That contradiction, destroyed by bombs yet comforted by chocolate, would outlast the war, coloring their memories of America as both conqueror and caretaker. As the European front lines disintegrated in the spring of 1945, the smooth machinery of humanitarian logistics began to fracture. The same networks that had once delivered comfort across oceans and continents were now strangled by the chaos of collapse. Neutral nations like Switzerland and Portugal, along the arteries of Red Cross coordination, faced disrupted rail lines and seized ports. Warehouses in Geneva and Lisbon filled to bursting with crates that could no longer move. Trains sat idle, their manifests destined for camps that no longer existed or had fallen to advancing armies. For thousands of German prisoners held in Europe, the steady rhythm of Red Cross parcels stopped without warning. Weeks stretched into months, and when no chocolate arrived, rumors bloomed like mold, claims that the Allies had turned vindictive, that America had broken its promise of humane treatment. Across the Atlantic, the situation was little better. Wartime rationing and shipping constraints tightened supply lines even in the United States. Chocolate, once plentiful, was now divided among troop rations, medical kits, and prisoner parcels. Factories in Pennsylvania and New Jersey struggled to meet military contracts as cocoa imports from West Africa fluctuated under convoy losses and port delays. The American Red Cross fought to maintain delivery schedules, even as shortages forced smaller portions and reduced variety. Yet within the camps, few prisoners blamed their captors. By then, trust had replaced suspicion. Most understood the delays as another symptom of a world unraveling. Each unopened crate represented more than lost calories. It marked the fragility of decency under total war. When shipments finally resumed in late 1945, the return of chocolate felt symbolic. Its taste, once routine, now carried the sharpness of memory, the endurance of order over chaos, of compassion refusing to yield, even when the world around it had fallen apart. By the winter of 1945, the long procession of return began. From ports like New York, Boston, and New Orleans, gray-painted Liberty ships ferried thousands of German prisoners back across the Atlantic. Their cargo holds now filled not with weapons or munitions, but with men who had seen the enemy's mercy firsthand. The mood on the docks was subdued, a mix of relief, apprehension, and quiet gratitude. For many, the camps they were leaving had become paradoxical sanctuaries, places of defeat, but also of decency. Some prisoners tucked away chocolate wrappers, Red Cross box labels, or even handmade carvings as tokens of a strange fraternity formed in captivity. American officers recorded farewell ceremonies where prisoners sang, saluted and offered small gifts, embroidered flags, wooden figurines or squares of chocolate saved from final parcels as gestures of respect toward their former guards. The journey home, however, brought a new reckoning. Germany lay in ruins, cities flattened, families scattered, hunger omnipresent. Men who had lived well in America returned to find resentment waiting for them. Their tales of fair treatment and unexpected kindness sounded like fantasies to relatives scraping for food amid rubble. Yet many ex-POWs refused to hide their experiences. They spoke of guards who treated them as men, of the order and fairness that seemed unthinkable under Hitler's regime. Some became quiet advocates of reconciliation, their perspectives seeding the post-war belief that compassion could rebuild faster than vengeance. Historians would later trace echoes of that ethos into the Marshall Plan itself, a strategic mercy shaped by memory. Still, for those who had tasted sweetness in captivity, freedom arrived with a bitter edge. The chocolate that once symbolized hope now reminded them of guilt, the knowledge that survival too could wound. Yet in that contradiction, a truth endured. Even in war's darkest enclosures, humanity had found a way to persist. In the years that followed the war, scholars and soldiers alike returned to a curious question. How could something as ordinary as a chocolate bar carry such extraordinary influence? Historians studying America's prisoner of war policy concluded that it marked one of the earliest, if unintended, exercises in what would later be called soft power, the quiet persuasion born from decency rather than dominance. The United States, bound by law yet guided by conscience, had discovered that generosity could erode hatred more effectively than propaganda ever could. The Red Cross parcels, and particularly the chocolate within them, became symbols of this strategy in action. Fairness and abundance as instruments of moral strength. Psychologists noted that the emotional resonance of such gestures lingered far beyond captivity. Many former German POWs who later emigrated to America described their imprisonment not as humiliation but as awakening. The taste of chocolate in those camps had become for them a moment of cognitive dissonance, the realization that compassion could coexist with power. It was this revelation, more than lectures or re-education programs, that reshaped their understanding of democracy. The precedent influenced future humanitarian law and the treatment of prisoners in later conflicts, embedding the idea that respect for dignity was itself a strategic asset. Yet the truest legacy was not bureaucratic, but deeply personal. Veterans remembered the smell of cocoa rising through the barracks, the faint laughter it inspired, and the bewildering warmth of being shown mercy by an enemy. In the moral landscape of total war, that sweetness stood apart, proof that empathy could survive amid ruin. Long after the barbed wire rusted away, the simple act of sharing chocolate remained a testament to a greater victory. That compassion, even in war, could shape the peace that followed. In the spring of 1946, as the final ships bearing German prisoners slipped out of New York Harbor, the air hung heavy with fog and farewell. The Statue of Liberty blurred into grey mist, a silent figure watching the defeated depart. Few men spoke on deck. The sea absorbed their thoughts. Yet among them, a shared image endured, the first bite of chocolate behind barbed wire. It had come in a world stripped of comfort, unexpected and disarming. In that moment, they had tasted not only sweetness but the essence of something rarer, respect from an enemy. That single act, so small against the scale of war, had changed their understanding of strength. Years later, when former prisoners met again in reunions or exchanged letters across oceans, their stories returned not to the front lines, but to kindnesses, a guard who shared a candy bar, a parcel that arrived on a bleak Christmas, a gesture that restored faith in the idea of decency itself. The sweetness of those moments lingered long after the bitterness of surrender had faded. It became a quiet proof that mercy is the only victory that lasts. And so, when the last camps fell silent and their fences dissolved into rust and grass, one truth remained clear. Even in an age built on steel and fire, humanity endures in the smallest of gifts, wrapped in paper, smelling faintly of cocoa and hope.